All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out this morning for this. This is, as you know, one of the biggest fraud cases that the Tempe Police Department has ever participated in, as well as the Attorney General's office. As far as the amount of people, we've arrested over 100. We've arrested 100 people as of now, and we're currently have 109 indictments. So this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about this investigation that has lasted about a year and a half. Today, we have with us from the Attorney General's office, Andrew Pacheco. He will talk to us first. He's supervises the criminal division in the Attorney General's office. After Mr. Pacheco will be Chief Tom Riff, and he will address us with some comments. And after Chief Riff will be Commander Kim Hale, who is the commander over our Criminal Investigations Bureau, who will be able to give some more specifics.
Good morning. My name is Andrew Pacheco, and it is a pleasure and an honor to be able to stand here with the fine members of the Tempe Police Department who worked with the Mesa Police Department and the United States Postal Service to investigate, dismantle, and then assist us in prosecuting members of 5 different fraud mills that were operating within and from the city of Tempe. As Sergeant Pooley mentioned, there were over 105 individuals indicted. Those cases are still ongoing in terms of their prosecution, but this is a fine example of the good work that can be done when federal and state law enforcement officers work together and show these fraudsters that Arizona is not a safe place to do business. Thank you very much.
This is an opportunity that law enforcement would like to take to educate our community on the intricacies of a fraudulent scheme. We often hear about violent crime and call press conferences when we've made an arrest of an individual that's created chaos within our community. We often also hear about fraud and the impact that it's having on our community in terms of dollars lost. U.S. Secret Service reports that we lose over billions of dollars annually as a great nation as a result of fraud and identity theft. What we want to do today is we want to talk a little bit about this case. As I've said, we also often hear about fraud and the impact that it has on not only organizations but private business, but individuals. This case started with a Tempe police detective who was very vigilant in working one case at a time, starting to see patterns and trends of behavior regarding what we found to be a very orchestrated fraudulent scheme. Working with some of our agencies, for example, U.S. Postal Inspectors, the Mesa Police Department, loss prevention, specifically from Target, Walmart, and Bashas', and also members of the the Arizona Attorney General's office, we're able to dismantle this very sophisticated crime organization and bring many of the individuals to justice. As you've heard, as a result of all this hard work, over 100 arrests have been made, 105 indictments. And when we started to take a look at what happened and how this case unraveled, it came from just street-level crime, where individuals having access to office supplies and a computer, they're able to go through and replicate and make fraudulent documents, fraudulent checks, and then reaching out to other members of their criminal enterprise, were able to orchestrate in a very successful manner ways to go in and to victimize individuals like you and I, and also businesses. After approximately 18 months of investigation, we found that there was nearly $250,000 in loss to individuals and corporations as a result of these fraudulent practices. One of the other interesting aspects of this investigation that you will find is that having talked to some of the individuals, the 100 that were arrested, there's a common element. When asked why they were involved in this, 3 issues came up. 1, drug addiction, specifically heroin, and then number 2, the drug addiction of methamphetamine. We often hear about drugs and crime being interweaved. This is a perfect example. It's not just a residential home being burglarized, but individuals supporting drug habits have now relied upon the ability to go out and to victimize individuals through fraudulent schemes. The third was gambling, drugs and gambling. It's having a significant impact on our community. What I'd like to do at this point, and I know that the focus of your questions as the press is going to be, tell us exactly what happened, how did it get started, how did you unravel the investigation, and we're going to do that. I'm going to turn that over to Commander Kim Hale to answer those types of questions and get into those specifics. But as stated by Mr. Pacheco with the Arizona Attorney General's office, I too want to thank the men and women of all the law enforcement agencies as well as private corporation and business for helping us. Again, this is the largest in terms of numbers of persons arrested in a fraud case in the history of the city of Tempe. And it's my understanding from the Attorney General's office, it's the largest case they have also prosecuted in terms of numbers of individuals associated with a criminal enterprise related to fraud. So with that, I'll turn it over to Commander Kim Hale. Kim?
This case began approximately in about March of 2012, and it has several different, leads or heads to this particular case. The big box stores, your Targets, your Walmarts, the Food City, Bashas', they all have, very robust and very aggressive internal, investigative units that work hand in hand with law enforcement. And they also helped put this case together, and noticing some of the fraud and the checks coming in and the players that were involved, and they would put together some of their cases and then bring them to our investigations unit. In addition to that, as the chief talked about, the detective, starting from a single arrest coming out of patrol on a check fraud, started working his way up the organizations, trying to figure out who's all involved in these schemes and realizing that many of these cross over. And so that's how this whole thing began in about March of 2012. In the fraud scheme itself, we talk about a lot of the corporate victims that are involved, but this is not just a case about corporate victims. This is a case about our neighborhoods, about the cities themselves being impacted by these predators. And the way that this works is that you'll have a printer who's basically the head of the organization, and he will have people, just like any organization, that work for him, maybe a recruiter who goes out and finds people that will go out and get the checks themselves or the information off the checks. Those people are maybe your compromisers, and that they go out and they actually do the mailbox burglaries, or they'll break into a car and get into the checks. They're opportunistic thieves going through the neighborhoods and petty thugs that are taking advantage of individual victims throughout the city. And they will use the checks to then give it to check runners who will go out and cash the checks using sometimes their identity or fraudulent identity to complete the transactions. And then they will share the proceeds with the printer. And that's how this goes around and around and around. When somebody gets arrested or somebody uses up their identity where they can't be useful to the organization anymore, then they might, like I said, become a recruiter, and they get paid for finding other people who will use their identity to do these crimes. And so it continues to, they look upon people who are either drug addicts or gambling addicts. They know that they're desperate and they need the extra money. So this is how this perpetuates and continues to go through our family. This is a story about, like I said, it's crimes that are not only impacting our corporations, but our neighborhoods. And that's what I want to get, really put out there is that, we see the movies about identity theft, and we laugh, and we see somebody, living a lavish lifestyle, or we see the commercials on the banks about identity theft, and we see the people going there with their fancy sunglasses, living off of somebody else's money. But this organization is much seedier than that. This is, again, drug-seeking folks that when you go to their apartments or to where they're living, not so glamorous, and they are folks that are, sometimes covered in drug sores and different things, and it's a very ugly and seedy lifestyle. It's a story of broken families and crimes and ruined holidays for victims. So, that's pretty much how the case works. Any questions specifically?
So they would essentially steal checks out of people's mailboxes or any other way, take the numbers and print fake checks with the legit bank accounts.
Any way that they could get them, that's exactly right. They would steal them any way they could get them. Sometimes they would take, all they need is even a picture of a check. They'll pay people to say, hey, can I take a picture of your check? And if it's a corporate check that they got on a rebate or refund, they'll, they say, I'll give you $40 if I can take a picture of your check. And they take a picture of the check. And that's all they need is the information off the check. And then they run with it. Some checks are completely fraudulent, depending on store policies. They'll learn from somebody maybe that's been fired from a corporation or somebody that used to work at a corporation. They'll learn the internal policies, and they will print complete fraudulent checks to get around the internal policies of a particular corporation.
Were they writing the checks for small amounts to stay under the radar? Because when you think about it, you're talking about close to $250,000, but you have over 100 people in over a year and a half's time. It doesn't sound like a ton of cash for a network that's.
You're talking about hundreds of dollars, where you and I will notice $300 or $400 or $500 coming out of our accounts. Somebody like an SRP or an APS might not notice that much right away. They'll notice it eventually, but that's why they'll run this scheme as long as they can under certain individuals until they get caught or the corporation catches them doing it.
In terms of the sort of hierarchy how this works, Commander, are the printers the sort of kingpins? Are they the center of the operation?
In a sense, they would be the top of the organization. They're the ones that have usually the technology, the expertise, and the equipment to run this kind of fraud.
And when you identify 5 specific mills, is that where the printer would operate, 5 printers operating in 5 separate mills?
Correct. Or he might have one that was in a car and then plus in his apartment. But yeah, typically a mill would be attached to one printer, and then
That's what identifies a mill. It's where the checks are actually produced.
Correct.
Can you tell us
How
what
many
the
checks?
are?
How many checks do you think were passed, Commander?
I don't have the exact numbers on the checks, but hundreds, a lot of checks. So far, out of the hundreds of arrests they've made, they've taken about 100 years of Department of Corrections time of pleas. The case is going very well. The Attorney General's office has been an extremely great partner with us in taking on this case and the burden that it gives to one prosecutor. But it's extremely successful thus far, and I don't want to do anything to interrupt that.
Are you looking for more people at this time?
I think at this point we've got everybody that we have identified, and we've arrested most of our main players. Now we're going through the actual prosecution process, and But this is not over. I mean, people that got placed on probation or people that are out there that are friends of these people, they know the scheme, and they're going to go out there and continue to perpetuate this. And so as corporations change policies and as people continue to try to, fortify internally against this, this is something that as long as there's paper checks out there, this will exist. And so this is something that we all have to be cognizant of when we're protecting our property and we're working, in conjunction with our banks and with the corporations on trying to, stop this from occurring. But this is something that's still ongoing. So there will be more suspects in the future.
Besides the big name retailers, what are the victims and how many other people you said you're stealing checks out of mailboxes?
Well, you're going to have, all your I'd say majority of these are all big box stores, but you'll also have, the SRPs, the APSs, any of these big corporations that cut checks and rebates back to people, potentially all are victims in this as well.
And is this in the valley primarily, these stores, or is it throughout the state or the region? Where do you think they were passing?
Well, I'm sure that these folks, based on their geographic, proximity, they're all opportunistic, so they're going to stay fairly close to home. And so a lot of this was focused on the East Valley, but this is a statewide problem, if not a nationwide problem.
So when they would pass the checks, at what point would the store be alerted that it was a fraudulent check? After the victim or the average Joe who got a check stolen called the bank and said, "This is not me"?
Correct. Depending on how, which transaction occurred, if it was an individual transaction on a fraud check, they might take that check, try to, cash it at the bank, and the bank would say, that's a fraud account. It doesn't exist to anybody. So then they would learn about that internally, and they might turn that over, to a patrol officer. Or if it's good accounts and they've cashed the checks and they've gone for, 30, 40 days, they might find, 5 or 10 or 20 of these checks coming through. They'll accumulate them, and although they cashed them and they're actually good accounts, they'll internally start putting together some, videos and things trying to figure out who it is, and they bring a package to our investigators and say, this is what we've uncovered thus far. Can you help us take it to the next level and figure out who these people are and what's going on? So,
What advice would you have for people to avoid being victimized?
Protecting your checks and your private information is one of the biggest things that we've been dealing with, as a community, and as identity theft's been huge. Like I said, they make commercials about it, they make movies about it. Identity theft protection is great, but at the end of the day, you can't throw your checks away. You're going to have to, learn to shred those, burn them, keep them. leaving things in your vehicle that are, especially in plain view, those things need to be brought in. Even if it's inside your house, putting them away safely someplace so they're not readily and available to people. And then people just have to be better better citizens, where if you're going to a check cashing center and somebody says, hey, can I take a picture of your check for $40? It takes you 30 seconds or 3 seconds to make $40, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of victims that's going to result in, and you got to realize what they're doing with that information. And so we need people, that at least to step up and not, I guess, accept that deal and walk away from those. So this is it's a systemic problem. As long as there's people that are succumbing to gambling addiction, drug addiction. There's always going to be the opportunistic thieves out there that are going to continue to prey upon the neighborhoods, and we've got to do everything that we can to stop it.
Well, it just seems that that's sort of frustrating from the consumer standpoint, because at the same time that you guys have these checks being stolen and washed and, duplicated, et cetera, you've got Target being hacked with debit cards. It's almost like you can't win. Somebody's going to steal from you no matter what.
It's going to be more and more difficult in the, I guess, in an electronic data age. And, Targets, your Walmarts, I can't stress enough to actually how aggressive and proactive they have been and what great law enforcement partners they are. This is something that they recognize is a problem for them, and they work hand in hand with us in trying to combat it. And so it's not like people are sitting by complacent on those. They're working at it. But every time that you change a policy or you change a computer program to try to strengthen, somebody finds a back door to it. And so we got to continue, I guess, stay on top. We've got to be vigilant in trying to continue to combat this. But you're right. It gets frustrating, and it's an ongoing problem. But the harder we make it, I guess, the fewer these people are going to be successful in doing it. This isn't a group of rocket scientists up here. These are people that, they come up and they find little, tweaks and policies that they can try to get around. And, some of these people knowingly go in there and use their own IDs. And they know at the end of the road, they're going to probably do prison time. But at the end of the day, they don't care as long as they get that next fix, or they get enough money to go down to the casino and throw it in the slot machines or something, hoping that they're going to get the big score, only so they can go and spend it on drugs to get the next fix. And so it gets to be, kind of, I guess, self-supporting, so to speak.
Were these 5 different mills affiliated, or were they just doing their own thing?
Most of them are doing their own things, but they'll have affiliated, I guess, partners where, somebody's running checks for one mill might be running checks for another as well.